Hello, everybody. Welcome to this beautiful space. Welcome to everybody who has joined us here in person, and also to those online from multiple places in Canada and around the world. Before we get started, I would like to invite Dean Donna Kotsopoulos to share a land acknowledgement.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Donna Kotsopoulos, and I'm proud to serve Western University as the Dean of the Faculty of Education. We acknowledge that Western University and Goodwill Industries is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape-Wak, and Chinookan nations, who have long-standing relationships to the land and the region of southwestern Ontario and the City of London. The local First Nations communities of this area include Chippewas of the Thames First Nations, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and Munsee Delaware Nations. This land is also connected to the London Township Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum. I wanted to share a few remarks before we begin about how grateful I am for the work of Katrina, Peter, and everybody at the Centre for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. There's a number of you in the audience today who heard me speak at the alumni group last week, where I talked a lot about CREVAC and the important work that they've done throughout their history that has impacted my own life personally. It's a tremendous source of pride for the Faculty of Education and for those of us who've experienced gender-based violence to see this kind of work happening. What they're doing leaves a positive impact, not just in our city, but across the country and across the world. Indeed, CREVAC is a global lighthouse in ending gender-based violence. I'm so privileged to work alongside them. Thank you for coming today to organize. Thank you for continuing to organize this important event. It's one that we look forward to each year. I also wanted to thank Dr. Cathy Humphreys for making the trip up to London for us today. I've been looking forward to your talk for some time now, and I'm really grateful that you're going to be able to share your insights with us and that you've journeyed from so far to deliver this important talk to our community. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Donna. Your support and your leadership for our center has allowed us to really continue to grow and flourish, and I'm deeply appreciative. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the lectures. The Jaffe Lectures were started in 2021 as a way to recognize and honor the contribution of our colleague, Peter Jaffe, and all of the work that he has done and the contributions made to ending gender-based violence. If you know Peter, you also know about his dedication to ending domestic violence and his enormous influence on generations of researchers, social service providers, mental health professionals, teachers, lawyers, judges, and others on this issue. When Peter moved to emeritus status, it was only fitting that we continue his legacy by offering a lecture series aimed at sharing learning. You're going to hear from Peter during this fireside chat part of this lecture. This year, though, I want to make two additional remarks. First, in addition to recognizing Peter, this year's lecture is dedicated to Claire Crooks, who is our friend and colleague here at Western, and the director for the Center for School Mental Health. Claire passed away on June 28th. She was Peter's postdoctoral student over 20 years ago, and together with many colleagues, they published over 3 dozen articles and chapters related to preventing violence against women and children. One of their papers was cited last year by the Supreme Court of Canada on the impact of violence on children and parenting. Claire's work and her legacy is significant to the advancement of knowledge and strategies to better support children and youth, in part by putting mental health support directly in schools and classrooms. Claire's center and ours are dedicated to supporting children's and youth mental health, and as part of that, safe and supportive relationships are key. Because when we can help people to develop good relationships, feel and be connected to peers that they can turn to, recognize when relationships are unsafe, we create the conditions of self-worth. We prevent mental health problems, and we prevent gender-based violence. Claire was also a national leader in pushing us to think about the full context of people's lives. One of the many programs that Claire developed is called Strong, which is a school-based intervention for newcomer youth. And one problem or one challenge for this program is a tendency to over-focus on individual youth's resiliency. But as Claire so eloquently wrote about and talked about, without attention to the larger context of these youth's lives, without focusing on, and if we focus solely on their skills, we're really going to miss what we can do, and we potentially stigmatize these youth further. Context really, really matters. And as Claire would fully appreciate, the context for children and young is very challenging. Over the past couple of years, we've been living through an overwhelming increase in children's experiences of violence and conflict around the world. Although a lot of our collaborative work is focused on the effects of violence against children at home, I wanted to also take a moment to recognize and focus on the broader issue of children and war. Last week, on November 20th, UNICEF released their 2024 report on the state of the world's children. The report underscores, and I quote, "Armed conflict presents one of the world's greatest risks to the rights, lives, and well-being of children around the world. In particular, in the Central African Republic, Gaza, Haiti, Sudan, and Ukraine and Yemen, places where UNICEF identifies that violence is currently a constant in many children's lives. As we know, hundreds and thousands of children have been killed or have lost their parents. And surviving children have lifelong trauma from the exposure to death and destruction. And of course, the effects of conflict on children go beyond the immediately visible and the physical dangers and costs. The less visible forms of harm are also devastating. That's increased risk of mortality to women and children. It's increases in violence, including gender-based violence. Children also lose access to essential needs and services such as water and sanitation and education. And these deprivations deprive children of what they need to grow and develop. Conflict also displaces children from their home, disrupts their routines, and exposes them to much greater risks of violence. Funding, we know, is well beyond the levels required to meet and protect the needs of children impacted by conflict and prevent conflict from emerging in the first place. To recognize these urgent and painful international realities, I'm putting up on the screen a list of international aid organizations that we, as individual members of CREVAC, are supporting. And I would ask you to consider your support for these kinds of organizations as well. And as we think about this, and I think about Claire's work and her attention to context, we think about all the ways that children and youth here in Canada may be impacted by these events, whether through their personal and family connections, experiences and events at school, or peer groups, or just in terms of their exposure to media and conversations. And I think about when we fail to promote empathy, understanding, connections, and relationships. I think about how we risk creating environments that can perpetuate further division and harm. So in this time more than ever, we need to concentrate on fostering and accepting connected, healthy environments that support and address the harms that we see around us and that value and support connection in relationships. And with that, I would like to pass this to Margarita, who is our director of the Learning Network and Neighbors, Friends, and Families, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Katrina. Before I formally introduce Dr. Cathy Humphreys, I'd like to briefly explain how we'll be facilitating the Q&A period with Dr. Peter Jaffe and Dr. Humphreys following the lecture. So for those of you who are joining us online, we'll be using an audience interaction platform called Slido. Throughout the lecture, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions and upvote those from other participants. While questions with higher votes may be addressed first, please know that all questions are valuable and we'll do our best to cover as many as we can. And for those of you who are here in person, you can simply raise your hand during the Q&A, and one of my colleagues will come to you with a microphone. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Cathy Humphreys, our keynote for the 4th annual Peter Jaffe Lecture. Dr. Cathy Humphreys is Honorary Professor of Social Work at University of Melbourne. A multi-million-dollar program of research in the areas of domestic and family violence and out-of-home care has been sustained since 2006 and supported through 20 category Australian Research Council grants and numerous other grants from government, philanthropy, and community sector organizations. Developing the knowledge base to support practice and policy developments in the areas of domestic and family violence, as well as that of vulnerable children in out-of-home care, drive the research program with her team at University of Melbourne. Over the past 8 years, she has worked on 7 projects with the Safe and Together Institute using practice-led action research through facilitated multi-stakeholder workshops and communities of practice. This research highlights the impact on and importance of attending to children in the context of domestic violence. She worked at the University of Warwick for 12 years before returning to Australia in 2006. For 15 years, she worked as a social worker. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cathy Humphreys to the stage to deliver her keynote address.
So thank you very much, Katrina and Donna and Margarita, for that welcome. It's been a great pleasure to be here. And can I also echo your acknowledgement of First Nations people and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and all the wonderful emerging leaders. So thank you for this opportunity to speak in this important lecture series. I feel both humbled and privileged to have been invited. While recognising that I hold a very Australian and UK experience, not to mention Australian accent, I may not, some of these things may not translate well to Canada, so apologies ahead of time. It's also a moment to be seized and an opportunity to explore more closely the issues to address children experiencing domestic violence. So I now also look at this title, Keeping Children Visible in Domestic Violence Research, Policy and Practice. What have we learnt in 30 years? Whoops. And it makes me think, maybe we should have said visible and safe through domestic violence research, policy and practice. Because visible is one thing, safety and well-being is another. Respected, heard, and action taken a further important step. So what have we learnt? I've had a great deal of difficulty in terms of framing this presentation. Is the glass half empty or is the glass half full? There's times of despair and times of hope, and I guess it's a theme that I'll return to continually through this presentation. I thought I needed to have a bit of a potted history of children and domestic violence, particularly highlighting the importance of Peter Jaffe and his team's work, and therefore weaving just a little bit of history through this presentation. What and how have things changed for children, and from whom are we learning? So my first article on children and domestic violence was published in 1998. It does represent more than 25 years of researching and publishing in this area. So there's been so many interesting developments, including developments about knowledge in this area, which configures this question of what have we learnt and from who. There's some issues in relation to children in their own right that we might like to explore and think about. And there's been promising developments in our responses to children living with domestic violence. The Safe and Together model has been one that I've also been looking at, as has already been explained by Margarita, but there are many other models which we might look at to try and get a better and more domestically violence-informed approach to children. Also in the area of prevention, recovery and healing, big shout out to all of Katrina Scott's work and that of Angelique Jenny and Ramona Alagia, Simon Lapierre, and they've all been great Canadian colleagues through this journey, and Nadine is here as well. So, it's been a great journey along the way with our Canadian colleagues, many of whom have worked and brought their work, their important work, to Australia. So let me start with doing a little bit of positioning of myself in relation to this presentation. Is the glass half full or half empty? It's very much dependent on the perspective at any given time. And so I take it as a gestalt moment. I think for 1 minute, it's fantastic, what a great development. I was thinking a lot about that yesterday when I was listening to all the work in the team with Katrina and others of her colleagues. Some fantastic stuff, and leaves you thinking, wow, this is a wonderful moment. On the other hand, you also then hear about the next child or young person where their parent has been killed through domestic homicide, and you feel that sense of despair. So I guess it is about whether, you're looking at this very ornate glass in that picture, or whether you're looking at two people just looking across at each other and staring across a divide. So I've got these gestalt pictures all the way through the presentation as a way of just a little metaphor, really, to a reminder of that we can hold dual perspectives simultaneously and at one time. And so is this lecture a lecture of hope or despair in this changing landscape and knowledge building for children and young people living with domestic and family violence? And just recognising too that we are in a wider context of social, political and culture, and that, we need to understand and think about ourselves and this work within that wider context. It did remind me very much of a recent podcast I'd heard from Fintan O'Toole. He's a political analyst and journalist from Northern Ireland, and he was looking at the US elections, talking about, was there a mobilisation of hope or a mobilisation of resentment and self-pity? And I thought his analysis could also, though it was about a political analysis, could equally be applied at the very personal level. So this issue about, have we failed children living with domestic violence, or have we made some progress in attending to their experiences, their safety, their health and their well-being? For example, Simon Lapierre were at a conference, the European Domestic Violence Conference in Iceland last year, and we listened to a very good symposium by some colleagues from Canada when they were particularly focusing on the context of children and child protection. And at the end of it, we sort of looked at each other in despair and thought, we could have been giving this lecture and that symposium 2 decades ago, and we would be having the same stories and the same narratives that are emerging. And I have to say, I've been quite concerned in my last few days, travelling, talking at refuges, listening to issues in relation to some of your lawyers, listening to the child protection workers or people who refer to child protection, and finding that there's a lot of criticism remaining in that space. So I thought I might return to that area a little bit. But then, when I go into that space of going, oh my God, what's changed? I then shift to a recent conference where young people who with lived experience of domestic violence spoke of their journey of healing through a really excellent group work program that ran parallel with the support for their mothers and a support group. Yeah, so they had a support group and their mothers had a support group. And you think, they were so excited by their experiences. Just made you feel quite differently about the space. And so when drawing on this lens of hope or despair, I do draw some analogies also from the counselling context, where they were looking at, so I read this paper that I thought was really interesting about counselling and what were the seeds of change for the clients that they worked with. 50%, so it's quite a systematic review, 50% was about the relationship with the counsellor, 25% about the model, and that's actually where all the papers tend to go about, is it CBT, is it this, is it that? And 25% was about the ability to instil hope, that change was possible. And I think that that is part of thinking about where we want to land as we think about both stories of despair but also stories of hope and resistance. So as a bit of an aside, I do wonder whether these pictures are a bit of a distraction or really a helpful explanatory metaphor as we go through. So, for example, when we look at the complex perspectives held simultaneously, emotionally holding hopelessness while still nurturing hope. Are you listening to the message or you're trying to work out whether you're seeing the donkey or the seal? Or maybe you're doing both things together. That's what I'm hoping. So it's the notion of simultaneously doing both things together. So then at this point in the early part of the lecture, it's also worth raising the question of what would progress look like for visibility and action for children living with domestic violence. Now, the simplistic answer is always that they would feel safer and their wellbeing enhanced. But I also think we probably need a bit of more of a nuanced approach because our research, policy and practice occurs in a very wide range of areas across that public health prevention triangle. I'm apologising for the fact it's not very readable. Yeah. And it's even less readable when you put the circle around. Anyway, but I did think that there's a few variations on that theme where we really need to understand that actually there's a great diversity in the experience and that we need to tackle the issues of intersectionality and that the structural, cultural and economic context in which we're working is absolutely critical, absolutely crucial. That we do know that actually the experiences for First Nations children and young people, LGBTQI children, children with disabilities, children in poverty, can look quite dramatically different for some children than for others. You'll also notice that, we have the standard and incredibly important primary prevention, top of the triangle. This is where we always want to have those experiences of stopping the violence before it starts. And, I'm sure that we think that that's where a lot of the answers lie. But there's secondary prevention. Are we attending to earlier intervention for children that are at risk of living with domestic and family violence or of intergenerational abuse? But you'll notice that in the third sector, usually, the tertiary sector, I've divided that into two spaces, or at least Desmond's divided it into two spaces, where you have crisis intervention. This is our that crisis work with women and children living with domestic violence, and particularly the police response, the response from child protection, the specialist family violence and refuge sector and outreach programs. And that's in fact where so much of the money and funding goes. So I did think it's worthwhile separating that out from the issues of post-crisis intervention, those issues of healing, recovery, which are also incredibly important, but which tend not to get that same level of attention and funding. So when you look at that diagram, do you get some sense of hope and yes, look at how well we're doing, at least in some of these spaces, or do you get quite a visceral sense of, oh my God, we could have done better? So I guess there's that, and I have that sense myself, so I don't really come up with an answer in that space, but I do think that it's a way of trying to configure and think about what we're doing in this area. So here's another diagram. So in our research team, we really try and work with the knowledge diamond. And that means that whenever we're working together, we're trying to think not just about the research evidence. We often start with the scoping review and all that. What's the research telling us in this space and what can our research say? But equally important in terms of the knowledge building in an area is what practitioners bring, those practitioner researchers, but knowing that the way in which practitioners' work configures this space enormously and their knowledge counts. The policy perspectives, what do policy workers bring into their space? And incredibly important, what do we think about and know about the knowledge building from those with lived experience? We do know that this diamond has many facets, that in fact it's not quite that simplistic. There's an awful lot of people with lived experience who become practitioners. There's an awful lot of policy workers that go off and do their PhDs. That it's a complex, multifaceted diamond, but it is worth thinking about where's our knowledge coming from in this space. So let's begin with the research facet and that classic picture of the young woman or the older woman, the crone or the princess. And the work of Peter Jaffe, David Wolfe and other members of the research team was so influential internationally in their space. That first paper that they wrote, Wolfe, Jaffe, Wilson and Zach, and that they were the first ones, like the domestic violence sector was talking about children and domestic violence and had been for years. But this was the first really important piece of research that was published in this space. Because I know that when I came to the University of Warwick, that my colleague, Professor Audrey Mullender, who'd led quite a lot of research in this, eventually led quite a lot of this research in this area, a little miffed that the Canadians had rather stolen the space at the beginning. But anyway, we did build on that work. It was so important, and it was a very good study. There was a comparator, and you could see, and they made the case very clearly that children living with domestic violence were profoundly affected and harmed in that space. We built on that work in the UK and in our work with Women's Aid, but we also built on it further when I returned to Australia in 2006. And so dipping into these papers returns me to that glass half full or glass half empty moment. You think, what's half empty about all this? What is the perspective here? Should we say that this work provided the basis for a burgeoning knowledge of children and young people living with domestic violence? We progress, we grow, we understand more about these children's experiences, providing the evidence and the policy shift for practices, for policy workers and practitioners to respond more effectively. And we've also become better on looking at some of the measures, like Emma Howarth. She put out a call, before COVID, halfway through I think around 2016, she put out a call to say, actually, are we looking at the right measures for children? We keep on measuring their behaviour and mental health, but we're not looking at their safety. And just recently I saw this article by Booth and their team, 32 different instruments being developed around validated child report measures in this space of domestic violence. And I thought, actually, while they said there were limitations in many of those validated programs, those validated measures, that actually was a step forward in terms of trying to think about appropriate knowledge building in this space. However, what's the negative side of all this? What's the flip side? Well, on a recent check on Google Scholar, an initial search on children and domestic violence, 2022, 2,740 articles initially came to light. And then another search, 4,000 articles. So this is that look both ways moment. Is all this evidence of the various forms of harm to children important in building our understanding and our knowledge? Or is it a bit of an industry for researchers where, in fact, how much knowledge is too much knowledge? How much do we really need to know in this space? because at some level, there's been very consistent findings that the emotional well-being of a substantial group of children is undermined by living with domestic and family violence. It's not really rocket science, isn't it? Basically, any pub will tell you, any pub will give you that test. So, a meta-analysis back in 2003 by Kitzman showed 118 studies showed significantly poorer outcomes on 21 different psychosocial measures for children witnessing family violence than those not living with family violence. So looking at papers that had the comparator. She also noted 63% of children and domestic violence were doing worse than those not living with domestic violence. It's interesting that it is always and fairly consistently a third of children that are doing as well as other children. Children live in very different contexts of protection and vulnerability, and that is part of the importance in terms of our practitioner work, in terms of our policy development. There's also been longitudinal studies that are really important, because probably the area where maybe we need to do a little bit more work is showing that very young children, that babies, and in the womb are also profoundly impacted. And some of those longitudinal studies are showing that pretty clearly. So this one, though, back in 2007, by Rivera and his colleagues, they took 760 children. There was no history of IPV, and 631 children where there was, where their mothers were living with a history of interpersonal violence. The health usage data over a period of 11 years was taken, and it showed that children who had lived with domestic violence in the past were very high users of health services. Their health had been compromised by their experiences of living with domestic violence. And, I imagine many of you are seeing them every day, that they were 3 times more likely to access mental health services and significantly higher use of accident and emergency and primary care. Their health was being significantly impacted. So we've got a lot of areas in the quantitative area of research, and I was just mentioning those longitudinal studies, also the prevalence studies, lots of studies of post-separation violence, issues of child development impacts, poly-victimisation, some, though not enough attention to resilience. So, there is a lot of research that's developed in this research facet. Are you seeing the duck or the rabbit in this particular one? Let me just take a couple of examples from that list. Say they are prevalence studies. The Australian Bureau of Statistics highlights the significance of this issue, which profoundly affects about 25%. Well, they found 25% of children had been living with domestic violence, and that of those 5,000 children that they've surveyed, there was about 4.5% who was experiencing severe and chronic domestic violence. That's very similar to a similar study in the UK by the NSPCC, found very similar results. Just even if you look at our Victorian domestic violence incidents, children were present in 48% of cases. Our most recent study is the child maltreatment study in Australia by Ben Matthews and his colleagues. They took 8,503 randomly selected Australians aged 16 and over. So a very large study of child maltreatment. They actually found a different prevalence from those earlier studies. So it's a query about the fact that they found 40% experiencing domestic violence before the age of 18. Not sure whether that's about the measures that were being used, whether it is about an increase, whether it was about the fact that, you'll notice I've put randomly in inverted commas because it was said that it was a study of child abuse, and maybe we had an overrepresentation from people who had been abused. So a little unclear, but certainly a very worrying number. We're also looking at, he looked at significant levels of poly-victimisation, and the Finkel's study would show that as well, which showed that there was also very significant levels of physical abuse and sexual abuse occurring in the context of domestic and family violence. Probably one of the most worrying parts of this survey, so I've pulled out this massive amount of data, 44% had experienced domestic violence in their own peer-to-peer relationships. So that's of the 18 to 25-year-olds. Now, you've got to be terribly careful in working in this space not to, the children's biggest worries is that they'll end up like their mother and father. So you have to be terribly careful about this sort of data. But it does show a huge level of, intergenerational vulnerability. And it suggests that we must be doing more earlier intervention to look at children in this space and providing some sort of service to try and stem the tide of intergenerational abuse. So an area where I think we could argue that the person using violence calls the tune more than any other area is that around post-separation violence, and particularly in the where children have child contact. Now, back in 1998, Jaffe and Gaffner, a very important paper on custody disputes and the impact on children living with domestic violence and their experiences of child custody, and looking at how poor some of the decision-making was in that area. That was back in 1998, and we've had dozens of studies hundreds of studies since then. So Stephanie Holt's done some great work in this space with children's interviews and studies of post-separation contact. Marion Hester and Lorraine Radford did wonderful work on mothering and domestic violence. Some of the work that I did with another team in Australia, we wrote an article about more present than absent. I'd written a previous article, The Absent Presence of the Perpetrator, which is actually how we often see the person using violence disappear, and you only focus on the mother and the child. This one in this space is, in fact, that we need to take account of the fact that, and I'm using gendered language here, that, these fathers don't disappear from children's lives for the most part. And so thinking about what are the interventions that are required to both work with fathers as well as protect children. On some level you can get quite despairing about, we've had this knowledge for a very long time, and sometimes you do feel as though it's 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards. But on the more hopeful side, in Australia, David Mandel and the Safer Together team have been given a continuing contract, it seems, to work with the Family Law Court, and they're training from the bottom up. And he would say that they're pushing on an open door. We are sort of anecdotally seeing some better decisions around thinking about the children's safety and well-being in the child contact space. So just when you think about despair, you can also think about hope. Just even looking at the work that's being done at the centre, and I was at a training day on the online development of the Safer tool. What a terrific development, and a way of making sure that domestic violence is identified, at least so that identification of domestic violence is coming through to the courts, so they have that information in a domestically violence-informed way. So, there's both despair and hope there. So let's move on to thinking about the lived experience facet of qualitative studies with children, because in fact this is an area where you can feel quite a visible sense of hope and promise. That, this has been a significant shift in the research, that if we're looking at children living with domestic violence, that to actually be asking and talking to them about their experience is pretty important, and to understand and to work with those experiences. There was a recent publication, 33 publications that were looked at in a systematic review of all the work in the qualitative area in this space, and what children were saying about their own lived experiences of living with and experiencing domestic and family violence. And it's a work where you can feel there's a more ethically sound basis to not doing work on children, but doing work with children. So let me just talk about 2 research studies that we did in this area with PhD students. PhD students are terrific for working with the lived experience because I guess, it takes a lot to get the site access and the access to children in this space. And, our PhD students work incredibly hard to get that access. And if you're getting paid for research, you often don't get paid for the time to do all that very difficult access work. So there's one by Katie Lamb, Seen and Heard Embedding the Voices of Children and Young People Who've Experienced Family Violence in Programs for Fathers. She was actually just talking to children about their experiences of fathering. And Safety and Resilience at Home, Anita Morris's work. So just looking further, let me just talk a little bit about Katie's work. She's continuing to do some wonderful work in the area of lived experience. She interviewed 14 children and young people with experience of domestic and family violence and talked to them about what they would look for in a father. They then, a small group of them, 8 of them, continued to work with ACME, our Centre for the Moving Image, and made wonderful digital stories, some of which are used in the Caring Dads program. These children said they made these stories because they wanted them to be used for training and for work in programs with fathers who used violence. And that we took them to also to 21 facilitators of parenting, healing and men's behaviour change programs. Interestingly, some of those facilitators are going, I think they're a little hard-hitting. I'm not sure that we could show those to the men. So, it was sort of interesting, the different perspectives that you get when working in this space. But what did she find as well? About young people had very clear views about reparation. So not every young person talked with all these themes, but putting them together, these themes emerged. Address the past, acknowledge your wrongdoing, acknowledge the harm caused, apologise, accept the consequences. Secondly, commit to change. Once I thought an apology was all that was needed, but I don't think that would even be enough now. I need to see your actions have changed, because saying sorry, well, they're just words. I need actions to prove to me you are truly sorry. I don't care about the money or the bribes to win me back. I just want a father I'm not scared to see. And then there's issues about rebuilding trust. Invest time and effort, step up to parenting and co-parenting, and acknowledge the child's perspective is important. Notice my expect is important. Tell them it's going to be all right and work on it. Like, they're not going to trust him straight away, but he's got to work on it and let the kids know nothing. Now, interestingly, these very you can hear them very clearly. Well, Daniel Glazer and Claire Sturgeon in 2000 to make a report about what they thought about child contact in these situations. They said virtually the same sort of things. It's not that we don't know what to do in this space. Is there political will to take on the person using violence in this space is a big question. So let's look at Anita Morris's work in this area. So Anita interviewed 23 children and 15 mothers from a primary care population, so not from where we often draw children from the specialist sector, but from primary care. And this work was co-supervised by myself and Kelsey Hegarty. Kelsey and I supervised also Katie Lamb. We've worked with Nadine, so nice work in this space. Particularly one issue that Anita looked at was looking at what children require to negotiate their safety. And I guess the opposite of their agency is powerlessness. She could see there was a range of children that were doing pretty well and children that were actually having a very difficult time. She developed a model of children's agency, and she looked at what were the ingredients of agency for children. How could they be helped to negotiate and have a sense of safety. That was an awareness of disruption in the danger in the parental relationship. There needed to be awareness that actually this was not normal, that not every family lived with abuse. And so being able to name that and have a language for that was important. They needed physical and emotional distance from the perpetrator. Those children that were having weekly, very regular contact with the person who had used violence or was continuing to use violence were not doing well. Modelling child safety. These children who were doing well were surrounded by or had people in their network who modelled respectful relationships and communicated those. And then interestingly, the co-construction of family resiliency. By that, there was a group of children in this group who were not ashamed of their families. You know, there's a lot of shaming where there's domestic and family violence. These children felt like they'd moved on. They were proud of the fact that they'd been through a rough time with their mums and they were doing well. We're a good family. You should see my aunts. They are great women, etc. You know, there was some sense of that in the way in which these children who were doing well were constructing their understanding, were able to construct a sense of safety and well-being. So I guess just finishing off this issue about research evidence, and Stephanie Holtz helped me sort of think through when I was sort of in a little bit of despair at points, to think through, well, what have we done? You know, what's different? You know, there's a shift in the language. You know, we now talk about children experiencing or living with domestic violence or escaping from domestic violence. We're no longer just talking about witnessing. That children are becoming more visible. You know, there they are rising out of the stones. And that's a really important thing. There's potentially greater emphasis on resilience and the context of prevention, recovery and response, the 30%. Probably not enough attention in that space, but certainly it's there. Men as fathers who use violence, thank you, Katrina. You know, some really important work in this area where we're not ignoring men, but rather trying to think about the potential to work in that space. There's some, but not enough attention to diversity of experiences and intersectionality. And importantly, there's more focus on the protective factors in the mother-child relationships. You know, these are really important. What we know from Alicia Lieberman's work many years ago was that actually when you get children and mothers working together over a period of time on mother-child strengthening, that not only does the child have better outcomes, but so does the woman. So let's move on to practitioner and policy workers in that facet. I've put those two facets together because I'm going to run out of time. But it is really important to recognise that, you know, these workers are very important in constructing the response to children living with domestic violence, and really thinking about, are they, you know, they have a really important role in whether children are visible or whether children are marginalised, and in that space whether they're part of the solution or part of the problem. So I also need to really say very strongly that it isn't just about individual frontline workers, that in fact they respond in the context of their organisations. We've got this little trope in our team which is train last. Train last means actually do the work in the organisation. 70% of the change process lies in the organisational change. Setting the context so that when workers go to training or when workers are working the front line, they're in a space where they're able to do good domestically violence-informed work. Sort of leads me to this next little issue that's a bit of a bit of an irritation to me at the moment, this notion of children in their own right. You know, it's a trope that's going around very strongly now. And I guess I do worry that it's the next sort of pathway to mother blaming. That in fact, you know, you think at one point, that's about the human rights of children, isn't that fabulous? But, you know, I've always been very antagonistic to workers going, I'm here for the child. You know, that sort of, actually you're here for the child in the context of their relationships. Where is the hope? Where are the safe relationships? Where do you need to be doing some strengthening of those relationships? And that's where the work lies. So in this space, are you seeing the baby in the trees being held, or are they invisible? Can you all see the baby? Because I think that in this space and in this area, so let's just focus a little bit now on the child protection space. Because I think that, to some extent we took a wrong turn in our response when we looked at children living with domestic violence, and we hitched these children to the statutory child protection response. And sometimes that was, but not always through mandatory reporting, but certainly there was a sense in which once you got recognition of children living with domestic violence, all the police referrals incidents were going to child protection directly where you had domestic violence. Now, that's a bit of a problem because actually there are big structural problems in the organisational context for statutory child protection, and it's called different names in different places. But, it was never set up to deal with domestic violence. So just adding on domestic violence to current practice and current organisational structures doesn't work very well. You end up with a distortion. So this is my don't blame the workers slide. Okay, so that actually is the organisation set up and putting them in the right training and the right protocols for their workers. First of all, the differential response. Actually, it's not a benign thing to refer to a statutory agency for state intervention. This is supposed to be only used at the tertiary end, the pointy end. When you push all these referrals straight into domestic violence, then, just think about the 30% that are just doing as well as other children. They get nowhere near the threshold for an appropriate child protection response. So we need to think about what is it and how could we triage earlier so that all these children were not going into the statutory child protection. It just closes down help seeking big time, and it closes it down particularly for marginalised people. That when you look at the racism, when you look at the residential schools in Canada, when you look at the stolen generation in Australia, the first people to close down help seeking when they think that they're going to be referred to child protection are those children and their families that are most marginalised. So that we need to think more carefully about how we use state intervention. But also it's hopeless inundating the State Child Protection Authority with thousands of referrals that go nowhere. They go straight out. And so that then you can't see the wood for the trees. We need to be using our state child protection service appropriately because there are a group of children that desperately need child protection intervention. Secondly, child protection was never set up to look at and to deal with the fact that you've got a victim adult survivor and a victim child survivor. And unless that's recognised, you get mother blaming. So how are we working in that space and how do we deal with that space? The work with men, whether they're good men, great fathers, or whether they're abusive fathers, is very undeveloped. We haven't got a workforce that's trained to walk happily with men. We're dealing with how do we deal with the complex interlocking issues of mental health, AOD, and domestic violence? These are the children who are actually coming into care. So 3 times more likely to come into care. If you just have domestic violence alone, when you've got the other complexities, 3 times more likely to come into care from our latest child protection data. So what we tend to do is not recognise domestic violence as a primary issue and to not look at how is substance use and the use of alcohol or other drugs being used as part of the tactics of violence and abuse. How is the mental health being used as part of the tactics of violence? This is substance use coercion and mental health coercion when it occurs in the context of domestic violence. It's part of and linked to or underpinned as an aspect of coercive control. I could go on. but I know I'm running out of time. But I guess a particular issue is really the issue of post-separation violence. There's often a sense in which unless women separate from a violent partner, I'm using gendered language here to recognise the dominant pattern, then they're seen to be not being safe. But actually, there's a significant group of children who are far less safe on separation. Unsupervised contact, 30% of the domestic violence increases on post-separation. So you know that in fact it's a very unsafe thing to do for a group of families, and particularly for children and their mothers. It's where I've tried to work more with the Safe and Together model. It's all very well to do a critique. I'm pretty good on the critique. but actually it's how do we work positively in this space to shape something different to happen. And actually there are some really good models there developed by Alan Wade and on the area of response-based practice, your Canadian colleague. But I've been working most with David Mandel and the Safe and Together Institute because I think they have a really good model. So this isn't about selling David Mandel and the it's about what are the principles that are in there that we need to get enhanced and in this space. Keeping child safe and together with the non-offending parent is the start point. That's the default position. Partnering with her or him, depending on, or them, is really, really important. And then not making the person using violence invisible. Intervening with the person using violence to reduce risk and harm to the child. And then there are the components of that. What do you need to do? What does that look like in practice? Okay, you need to map the perpetrator's pattern of coercive control. Not just say, this is a domestic violence relationship. These are dead words, they go nowhere. It is what are the behaviours that are then, and the actions taken by the person using violence to harm the child. Look at the full spectrum of the non-offending parent's efforts to protect the safety and well-being of the child. And then look at the adverse impacts on the person's behaviour, the person using violence behaviour, and the way that impacts the child. These are really important issues, and that they then need to be seen in the context of culture and of the other issues, the complexities around mental health and alcohol and other drugs and poverty. Just want to mention the huge importance of documentation. That in fact, you know, we've shied away, in the women's sector, we shied away from documentation. Actually, documentation is a really important part. It's a practice intervention that shapes the narrative. That we ignore it at our peril. Women going to the family court, going to immigration services, going to housing services saying, I'm escaping domestic violence. They need the evidence from the formal system to say that their children, themselves and their children have been impacted. And with that extra triangulation, they are really much more at risk. Holding the perpetrator accountable starts with language. Language and documentation stays with clients across services. It's an advocacy tool to create a domestically violence-informed narrative. It's so important, and when we've been working with practitioners in this space, they find this one of the biggest issues that makes a difference to their practice and their sense of doing ethical work. That attention to culture is essential and should be reflected in the documentation. Don't ignore the issues for marginalised children. And these impacts and the way in which we hold it across the service system are really important. Be practical, be detailed, make connections. It's a really important part of training, and it's one that we are, I have to say, when I look back at myself as a practitioner, it's not my best area of work. Let me move on quickly to healing and recovery. But it's one where now I'm going, you know, you teach best what you need to learn yourself. Well, you know, I think that that's an area which we ignore at our peril. Healing and recovery. You know, there's so much creative work happening in refuges. Fantastic stuff. It's been inspiring. Lots of work in the strengthening the mother-child relationship. Angelique Jenny's work on Mothers in Mind. Some of the work that I've done on the Talking to My Mum activities. work with the First Nations healing programs, attention to intergenerational trauma. There's so much happening in this space. I mean, the look back both ways moment is, are we taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back? Because just as you progress forward, then they cut the program. These areas in the healing space are the ones that are the first to get cut. So, we need to hold on to all the work that's happening in that space, but it's difficult. So thinking about healing and prevention for children, do need to look at that double-edged space, that in fact you do want to make sure that you're trying to get earlier intervention, you're trying to not have to be in the healing and recovery space. But when you are we also doing good work in that space? Are we just rescuing children from their mothers, or are we doing some really good healing work with children in their communities? And it reminds me of a quote from a Vietnamese colleague I heard recently. A happy child uses their childhood to embrace life, while an unhappy child spends so much of their life healing their childhood. It's a bit of a truism, isn't it? So are you seeing this horse rising with our healing programs, or are you seeing an unhappy frog? But just to finish the last couple of slides, listening to children and young people, really important project by Tim Moore from our Institute of Child Protection Studies, and you have work happening here as well. But what were some of the key messages from children? Take notice, believe us, act. It's a call for action. We do best when we listen to all facets of our knowledge building, from researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and those with lived experience. Children experience fear and despair when they live in turmoil of domestic violence, but nothing provides greater hope than hearing their resilience, their staying in the moment sense of fun, and reaching out to us to make a difference to their lives and those around us. That resilience that you see shining through sometimes when you're working with children is just so wonderful. Now, I guess it does make me think about workers also. We speak about vicarious trauma a lot, but do we talk about vicarious resilience? If you notice, the people that stay in this space over many, many years are those that have learnt to pick up on the vicarious resilience and be inspired by the strength of those that we are working with, even if they are working and living in very difficult spaces. We need to think carefully about our future actions. There is no doubt that after more than 30 years of highlighting the issues for children living with domestic violence, that we could have done better. We have learned a lot along this journey. Our knowledge base is far greater than it ever was. Our challenge is to make it work more effectively in every space on that triangle where we look to to prevent and respond to children. 30% of children living with domestic violence are doing as well as other children. What is it? What are the protective factors in that space that they are living with that make a difference, even if it's just a difference in the immediate and not in the long term? But what are the protections that they are finding, and how do we build into those resilient faces? So just finally, participation and visibility is a reflection of power relations. The least powerful require more resources and innovations to be heard. There was one young person in Scotland speaking to politicians. The politician said at the beginning of her talk, "What if I can't hear you?" And she said, "Listen louder." And I think that's a message for all of us. And that when we think about this, the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world we leave our children. And I guess for each of us in our own small way, we should be thinking about how can we leave a better space for children living with domestic and family violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cathy Humphreys. I feel you really provided such a powerful reflection and had us thinking about the foundation of this work. And then you also really were able to capture the progress, the changes, innovations in the field. And it's really nice for you to emphasize as well this way of making children visible in the work and integrating their voices, perspectives in research, intervention, and prevention work. So thank you. So we're moving now along into the Q&A session with Dr. Peter Jaffe and Dr. Cathy Humphreys. This is just a reminder in terms of how to join in on the conversation. For those of you that are online, you are able to submit your questions using Slido in the two ways that will be, I believe, on the slide shortly. So you can go to slido.com and enter the hashtag Jaffe 2024, or you can scan the QR code. And just to clarify for folks who are in the room, you may raise your hand, or also you may be able to line up here so that, here to the side. Oh, in the middle, sorry, right, there's where the microphone is. In the middle, so that people can line up and then ask their questions as well. Thank you.
Well, Cathy, a great presentation. Really appreciate how much ground you covered, and the glass is half full. I just wanted to tell you that.
Oh, good.
So this is our fireside chat. So picture a nice fireplace here, and I guess one of the things as you were talking and some of the challenges in the work, I'm thinking about the increasing work where you're dealing with lived experience and more qualitative research and being trauma-informed. I wondered some of your reflections on what we do to protect those survivors who want to come forward and share their story, because we're not therapists, we're researchers, and how do we protect them? And then how do we also protect the researchers? So if you're interested in your reflections on both.
I think it's a really, you can't just dive into this space and just think, oh, it's great to hear the voices of people with lived experience. Yeah, you do have to have a framework. And Katie Lamb and her colleagues, myself included, have gone on to develop a framework for working with lived experience, which provides some principles about working in this area. One of it is just you have to make some assumptions that some of this work will be triggering, and therefore how do you think about providing the ongoing support? And that means that you do need a coordinator, or you do need someone or a service that creates and continues to provide some support in this space. If you're if you're working with people with a lived experience and making sure that the work that you do is trauma-informed. I also think that we do train our workers to make sure that you are actually, that you are actually always trying to bring out that sense of hope and resilience. Always finishing with a sense of and feedback about the inspiration and hope that they bring into this space through being able to talk and speak. And for many of them, it is an opportunity that they haven't had. In fact, I was just saying yesterday that I want every social work student to do interviews in the research space, because it is where you are listening and asking them to consult on their experience, and you're not going in with your own change agenda. You're saying, I want to hear from you about your experience. And so there's a deep listening experience that happens there, which I think is really important. And you actually paradoxically, of course, in the old Rogerian thing, get something of a change just from the process of listening to someone deeply.
A number of people online have raised a number of questions, and there seems to be a lot of interest in the concept of vicarious resiliency. There's obviously hope in that. Can you talk a bit more about what that means?
Yes, well, it was only a concept I've picked up on and read about, only about 5 years ago. And I've been using it ever since, because it seems to me that we've not conceptualised that very well. That we've had a huge number of papers on vicarious trauma, but actually how you pick up and how you actually train our practitioners and think about ourselves in this space to be able to identify and to recognise when you're actually really feeling hope and and responding to their sense of resilience. I know that when I was working with one of my PhD students, who's an Aboriginal woman, she was looking at mothering through violence, and I was having trouble getting in touch with her when she was doing her field work. And I found her one day and I went, Siobhan, I haven't seen you. How's it all going? Let's sit down and talk about, those last few interviews that you've been doing, because I know that we couldn't have our last supervision session. And she said, oh, yeah. And she said, well, actually, we do a lot of laughing. and that, I know that we're talking about really serious stuff, but actually we are talking about it in ways that feel hopeful. And so there she is talking with actually women who'd been through some terrible times. But I know she's a very good practitioner as well as researcher. And her sense of liveliness from being able to pick up on humour and resilience in the stories was quite profound. And it showed through in the transcripts that she later did as well. So I do think that if we're going to train people to work in this space, then we need to really help them be able to articulate and experience both, emotionally, but also to be able to name it, what resilience and inspiration looks like, and be able to hold on to that in some way.
A number of people online were really curious about the 30% you refer to, the kids that seem to survive and thrive in spite of all that they've lived through. Do you want to expand a bit about what are some of your thoughts about what makes that 30% possible? And can we, also there's a question about whether we can learn from the 30% that ways that maybe help other kids survive in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's striking, you've probably seen this yourself, that there's a group of children that seem to be doing as well as other children. Now, there is some critique of that figure, saying, well, might be doing okay now, but what about later? And there's probably something in that. So, I don't want to be cavalier about that, nor do I want to say, look, all children have a right to live without violence. So that I'm not suggesting that this is great for children. I'm not at all. But I also think that there are different contexts of protection, and some of that is about how their mothers are supported. There's a lot of information about as the mother's mental health goes down, so does the child. Well, Chris Sullivan's work is really important in that space. Chris says, look, the intervening variable is the bloke who's who's using violence that they're both living with, but we tend to put it on the mothers and their mental health. Actually, both their mental health is going down through living with violence. Now, some of that might be indirect and some of it's direct. So I do think whether there are contexts, and I think that model of agency, which thought about some of those particular issues that children who had some sense of safety and well-being were living with, I think are important in terms of thinking about those children that are doing better than others.
I think we have a question in the audience here.
Well, I thought I'd get us started. It's a bit imposing to stand up here, but maybe if I do it, other people were. So, one of the things that's really struck me is about train last. And it made me think also about the need and the shift then from a leadership perspective around organizations and how they reorganize to be more domestic violence and gender-based violence informed. So I'm wondering about what you see in the half-full side of the glass around that kind of shift.
So it is, I guess, in the work that we've been doing with Safe and Together, where when David trains a group of people at the beginning of our program of research, we then follow it up with communities of practice, but we always have a program advisory group of senior managers. Now, they don't meet as often as the frontline workers, but we do make sure that some of those senior managers do some of the training and that we say you're not here just to advise, you're here to facilitate your frontline workers to make sure that they have the authorising environment to be able to create the change that they want to be. And so it is, and if you can't get senior managers on board, then it's probably not worth working in that space. You know, work where you've got some openings at the senior management level. You'll often get loads of enthusiasm from frontline workers, but you're setting them up to fail. So we really need to be thinking more about whole of organisation approaches. A bit like, you know, we've been talking about schools forever in whole of school approaches. We need whole of organisational approaches to thinking about if you want to make a shift and a change.
Another live question.
Hi, my name's Katie Mendez. I'm in the sociology department here at Western, and my research is around technology and its role in violence. And I'm wondering if you can say anything about the role that tech is playing for these children. So whether it's they're using it as a tool to kind of help them maybe find community among other, children who have experienced domestic violence, or whether you have anything to say about the role that technology is playing in continuing to facilitate domestic violence, even once, a mother has left. So just any kind of thoughts about the role of tech?
So, it's not my specialty area, but of course people in my team are doing work in that space. It's a really tricky issue. I know in Australia they've just tried to, they have passed a bill in Parliament today. Whether it's actually going to get actioned and how it will be actioned is another thing, but they're saying stopping social media for all children under 16. They're saying, look, we're seeing so much of the profound negative mental health effects on these children from social media. We're seeing so much of the technology being weaponised. We're calling to account the tech companies to say, the platforms to say you're perpetrating abuse, and calling them out as the perpetrators of abuse rather than the individuals, and saying this is your responsibility to do something in this space. Now, it's very controversial. There's a whole load of young people that are going to hate it and find a way around it, but it's whether it sort of puts a marker out and put a marker out to the platforms to try and develop at least some safe platforms as well. So that, the abuse via, whether it's via viewing pornography, way too early, whether it's looking at the way in which spy surveillance is being used, whether it's used by the person using violence to continue to abuse their partners or their children, really important questions. We shouldn't deny those, but we also should say, do children actually use it as part of their communities? They use it to communicate. Like, I know that there was, one young person in her digital story that she made was terrified when the first thing that her father did when she came to contact was take away her phone. She said, I felt so isolated. I couldn't contact my mother, I couldn't contact my friends, I couldn't contact my siblings. She was terrified. So, we can't pretend that this isn't part of people's identity is associated with their phones. I've even got mine beside me. That was just to keep a time, and I am time. But anyway.
Just maybe if I can just expand on that. I think one of the things we're seeing both in research and practice is the use of technology to stalk, harass, and monitor post-separation. And in fact, children are exposed to that as well in terms of what's happening and the impact on their mother. And actually that's one of the questions, David, I'll come to you in a sec. One of the questions is now that we're thinking way beyond physical violence, we're thinking more about coercive control and all the forms of coercive control post-separation. What are your thoughts about the impact of that? So it's no longer in the old days, we were talking about children exposed to violence, and it was usually physical violence. Now it's children exposed to coercive control. It's sort of much broader. you have thoughts, reflections on how that affects children?
Well, I think it's been incredibly important to go beyond incidents to looking at a pattern. And, that's been a really huge and very, very important development in this space. How we log that, how we recognise it, how we identify it, and in all its various myriad of different forms is really important. And one of the forms is clearly through the use of technology. Mind you, I know that there was a study and a very important piece of research done. There are about a zillion different tools that are used in the technology space to look at how to have contact between children and their parents and children and other children in the family law space. And I know that there was an important piece of research done looking at about the 30 different tools that had been developed because there's a need in that space. But it also looks at how that is also a space that can be equally used to abuse. One of the things about the use of technology is that to some extent it can track and log the level of abuse. It is evidence. And so, it can be trialled, and if it's not working, it can be stopped. And we need to think about its evidence gathering importance as well.
David, question?
David Warren in child protection at Children's Hospital for the last 35 years. With the recent changes in policy from the Ministry of Children and Youth and OACAS of move to zero children in care, do you think that policy in general will contribute or will assist domestic violence in general? And more particularly, will it help children or will it add to the crisis in children's mental health, particularly when these institutions are lacking the resources to assist these family challenges?
So I don't think that you can say zero children in care without providing a huge amount of resource to work out how you go upstream and how you stop children coming into care. I mean, there's a group of children that desperately need to be in care. They are in very unsafe environments. So how you then provide alternative environments or you intervene earlier to find safe places for them is really important. I mean, we only have to look at the mental health area where they closed all the big institutions and then didn't provide the resources to support all the people who actually need support and care with their mental health, even if it's not in a major institution. But, what it led to was a huge level of homelessness of people with mental health issues. So that we've got some examples there where things can go badly wrong. So I think that, resourcing in this space, but even the resourcing in this out-of-home care space, is really, really important if you provide good resources. See, if you provide no resources for kinship care, even if you find safe places for children in their families, in their wider family networks, there should be some resource that goes to the grandmothers or the aunties or the cousins that are looking after those children stepping in. You don't get that unless you actually go through, usually, some form of statutory process. And whether you call kinship care, out-of-home care, well, more than half our care in Australia is provided through statutory kinship care. So I think that some of it's about language and some of it's about resources.
I think we might ask you to answer the question that you asked yourself.
That's right. What do you think?
Just to maybe Cathy up to date. So it's a bit of a trick question because it's hard to answer. I mean, you have very well from the Melbourne perspective, but I think it's fair to say that you're referring to sort of a crisis in this province with sort of lack of resources within child protection system and also lack of mental health resources that are driving more children into care. Is that?
Both are hugely contributing to the problem. I see the deaths. I see the children are that coming back for physical care. I think my greater concern is really the challenge, are we just contributing to the number of addicted and mental health adults that are totally disabled in the future by ignoring this problem in childhood?
There's the upstream issue that we need to be addressing.
Any thoughts, just before you leave, any thoughts about remedies? So if you were Premier, what would you do?
If I were the Premier, I would love to be the Premier in respect to this. It was interesting that I challenged Minister of Health over 20 years ago about providing the resources for mental health for children, and she asked me that, why are you doing this, Dr. Warren, as a trauma director? I said, because it's going to be the major challenge of children's health for the next 50 years. That, yes, we need to provide more resources, not only in the CAS realm, but even farther back in the realm of mental health, children's care at the primary care physicians, at counselors, at every level, at an earlier stage, not at the end stage.
Thank you for your ongoing advocacy. It's great. Questions are piling up from the people online. There's an interesting question for you, Cathy. On the continuum of hope versus despair in the clinical context while working with survivors of intimate partner violence, could you elaborate on what model you think is most effective and why?
Well, look, I think it's horses for courses, isn't it? You know, that no survivors are, and so we're talking children. Are they talking children or adults? Children. I mean, in terms of children living with domestic violence, what model? I really think you have to start with models that look at mother-child strengthening, and that, you know, there's significant evidence in that space to show that children do best when they are able to have their resilience supported with their mothers. And so that's the start point. Now, that doesn't always work if she's got significant substance use or mental health problems, or, you know, sometimes she may be significantly disconnected from her child. But you start from the default position and you provide and put the resources into mother-child strengthening programs of various sorts. Like we've done a recent analysis of the work with Angelique Jenny, that it worked better when you had the mothers with 10 weeks of working just with other women, which they loved, and then transition to Mothers in Mind where they were working with their children. And so I think, you know, there are different models out there, and, you know, particularly, you know, our First Nations people, our Indigenous people, you know, they are saying very clearly that you have to deal with all our family members, that, you know, we have suffered enormously, and even if I'm separating from my partner, I want him to have a service, or at least have access to a service. That we need to be thinking about all the family responses much more thoroughly, and training our workers to work on relationship building rather than just working individually with individual adults or individual children. That in fact, particularly rescuing children from their mothers all the time can be very destructive practice.
Just maybe time for another few questions, or one question. One question that'll need a long answer.
Okay. I'll see what I can do.
There's a concern from a number of people online about protecting younger children. Obviously, with older children, you know, the concept of voice and disclosures and providing enough information for people to workers to do an assessment and develop a safety plan is one thing. With younger children who can't speak for themselves, and thoughts about safety and proper care for them living a situation of domestic violence.
Look, it's clearly, you know, it's not to be shied away from how complex that issue is. So that Stephanie Brown, this is going to be a long answer. Stephanie Brown and her colleagues at the Murdoch Children's Institute done a really interesting piece of longitudinal study. 3 waves of women. They looked at 1,500 women, I think, 1,500 women consecutively coming into women's hospitals in Melbourne. And of that group of women, when they did Kelsey Hegarty's domestic violence validated tool with those women coming, as they came in, those 1,500 women, divided out, 1/3 were living with domestic violence. So that, that's huge. And that's, and we do need to be really worried about those men. These are men who are responding to vulnerability with violence rather than protection. And how you work in that space with those men, there's some very interesting Aboriginal healing programs in that space in Australia, but we do need to be taking this issue of domestic violence for women in pregnancy and post-pregnancy really, really seriously, because it's double intention violence. It's violence against children and it's violence against women. And I think there are no easy answers because there aren't a lot of spaces for those women and children, and many of them at that vulnerable point desperately want to hold a family together. So how we bring in, it does bring in this notion of all of family. How do we do that all of family support at that point if they're not at the point of needing and wanting separation? If they do want and need separation, then we should put every resource into that space. Because really, this is a group of men, and the Canadian data in this space, the all prevalence data in this space showed that this particular group of men who were violent during pregnancy did not improve. In fact, they were some of your most violent men. So I think that this is an area, if you want to go upstream, then this is the area where we need to be doing the earlier intervention, at least earlier intervention in the life course of these children.
I think we're going to wrap up, and thank you very much, Cathy, for dealing
Peter.
with all these questions, and it's an honor to have you here.
How can I say no to you, Peter? Thank you, Cathy, for this important and critical review of the work and the lessons learned over the past 3 decades in advocating for children in the context of domestic violence. Children's visibility, safety, well-being, being respected, and importantly heard and believed. Thank you for reminding us that we can hold dual perspectives and at the same time the complexities of the issues related to domestic violence, while always nurturing hope and simultaneously reflecting on what we can do, right, better. That concludes our fourth Jaffe lecture with Cathy Humphreys. On behalf of everyone at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children, thank you to everyone who has joined us here in person and for those many people who have joined us online as well. And of course to our keynote, Cathy, and thank you, Peter, as always. Cathy, we have thank you, Mally, a small token. Everything is so organized, like it's unbelievable. Token for our appreciation for you. And I just want to also thank Cathy for spending time with us yesterday as well and allowing us to pick your brain on so many issues and questions that we have. So for our guests that are here in person, we invite you to join us for the post-lecture reception in the foyer just outside. So enjoy and thank you very much.